In the spring of 1941, as Nazi forces swept across Europe, an unassuming man in Lisbon penned a letter that would alter the course of history. His name was Juan Pujol García, a failed chicken farmer from Barcelona with no military background and no formal intelligence training. But what he lacked in credentials, he made up for in obsession, an unwavering desire to deceive the Third Reich. Pujol's hatred of fascism was pure and personal. The Spanish Civil War had taught him what tyranny looked like, and now he wanted to strike back. Not with guns, but with lies. He offered his services to British intelligence. They ignored him. Undeterred, he created a fictional identity, a fanatical Nazi supporter living in London. Using falsified travel records and an encyclopedic memory, he tricked the Abwehr, German military intelligence, into recruiting him as a spy. He signed his letters as Agent Arabelle. In reality, Pujol never set foot in London. He was in neutral Portugal, feeding the Germans a diet of fabricated reports, gleaned from public library books, outdated newspapers, and an occasional dash of creative storytelling. But the Abwehr believed every word. He invented a network of 27 sub-agents scattered across Britain, none of whom existed. He gave them backstories, addresses, and coded quirks. One was a Welsh nationalist. Another, a drunken dockworker with a love for pigeons. He reported troop movements, munitions deliveries, and port activity, all false, all plausible. Soon, the Germans were rewarding him handsomely, sending money for his network, which he deposited into a fake ledger. Still, Pujol needed more. He knew that to truly damage the Nazis, he had to gain credibility with the British. So he took a risk. He staged a fake arrest. Working with a sympathetic Portuguese journalist, he had himself denounced as a Nazi spy to British consular officials in Lisbon. The ruse worked. MI6 finally took notice. They saw his potential, and his results, and brought him to London under a new codename, Garbo. In a dim office on Baker Street, he joined the ranks of the XX Committee, the British double agent unit. Garbo's files were sealed. Only a handful of men knew who he really was. From London, his lies became more elaborate. He sent hundreds of messages, each one carefully crafted to build trust with his German handlers. The Abwehr grew so reliant on his intelligence that they began reshaping their own maps and strategies around his reports. But Pujol had something larger in mind. He wanted to orchestrate the greatest deception in modern warfare. And for that, he would need to fool Adolf Hitler himself. In 1943, Allied planners began shaping the most ambitious military operation of the war, a full-scale invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The stakes were immense. If the Germans could guess the landing site, thousands of Allied troops could die before reaching the beaches. The real invasion would target Normandy. But the Allies needed the Germans to believe it would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. This was Operation Fortitude, a massive deception plan involving dummy tanks, inflatable aircraft, fake radio traffic, and one extraordinary double agent, Juan Pujol García. Garbo. MI5 gave him a new assignment. Convince the Nazis that the D-Day landings would occur at Calais, and that any Normandy operation was merely a feint. To make it work, Pujol intensified his lies. His fabricated agents were given new, eyewitness reports. He described fictitious troop concentrations in southeastern England, non-existent supply stockpiles, and invented conversations overheard in pubs near Dover. The British helped. They constructed entire phantom divisions, complete with fake insignias and wireless chatter. A mythical army under General Patton was supposedly poised to storm Calais. But it was Pujol's narratives that bound the illusion. His messages to the Abwehr, painstakingly encoded and sent by radio, described the buildup in vivid detail. He was persuasive, meticulous, and never overly dramatic, traits that made him believable. In Berlin, Garbo's credibility soared. The German High Command began ignoring reconnaissance over Normandy, dismissing it as diversion. Hitler himself, obsessed with Calais as the logical invasion point, gave orders to withhold key panzer divisions from Normandy, just in case the real attack came later. Even on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Germans hesitated. Pujol sent a masterstroke message, warning that a larger force was still coming at Calais. The Normandy invasion was a distraction, he claimed. The Germans believed him. For 7 critical weeks after D-Day, Hitler held back reinforcements from Normandy, expecting another blow. It never came. The Allies secured their beachhead, pushing inland and beginning the long liberation of France. In London, Pujol remained in shadow. He asked for no accolades, took no public credit. But in Berlin, he received the Iron Cross, an honor rarely given to foreigners. It was awarded on Hitler's authority. The man who had never fired a bullet had become one of the most effective weapons of the war. Yet Pujol's story was not finished. Because war creates chaos, and chaos breeds suspicion. In the aftermath of D-Day, even as victory approached, his world began to unravel. The Germans began asking questions. And MI5 began wondering, could their greatest asset become their greatest threat? The summer of 1944 brought Allied momentum and German desperation. Paris was liberated, Hitler's armies were stretched thin, and the Nazi high command, once arrogant and composed, now scoured for answers to explain their strategic collapse. In Madrid, Abwehr officers grew uneasy. Agent Arabelle had predicted a second invasion at Calais, yet none came. Whispers of betrayal drifted through the corridors. Had their prized agent been turned? Or worse, had he been a British fabrication all along? Garbo knew suspicion would come. Anticipating doubt, he sent a carefully staged apology. Delays in communication, confusion among sub-agents, misinformation on the ground. He blamed the fog of war. Then he doubled down, flooding the Abwehr with detailed after-action reports that rationalized every failure as enemy deception. Incredibly, they believed him. Berlin remained convinced he was loyal. Some officials even argued that his previous success couldn't be undone by one misstep. After all, no spy had ever delivered so much actionable intelligence. Behind the curtain, MI5 tightened control. The British knew the war was shifting. Soon, Germany would fall, and the role of their double agents would change. For Garbo, that meant increased scrutiny. Each of his reports was now reviewed by a growing chain of censors and strategists. His handlers praised him in coded tones but offered no warmth. He had become a tool, valuable yet expendable. And Garbo began to feel it. He had sacrificed everything for this war. His home, his identity, his safety. Even his family lived under false names, constantly shadowed by danger. In late 1944, as Allied forces advanced through Belgium and into the Rhineland, Pujol made a startling request. He wanted to retire. MI5 refused. Too many strings still tied him to Berlin. Too many threads of deception were still active. He was urged to remain, just a little longer, to help dismantle the German spy network once and for all. But Pujol's health was failing. Nerves, ulcers, and exhaustion wore him thin. The lies had become a prison of his own making. He no longer remembered which version of himself was real. Then came the final signal. In January 1945, he sent his last transmission to the Germans. It was short, cryptic, and final. When Berlin fell in May, no agent named Arabelle was found among the captured records. To the Abwehr, he vanished like smoke. But the war's end did not bring peace for Juan Pujol García. The Soviets were scouring Europe for intelligence operatives. Former Nazis were seeking revenge. Collaborators were being hunted and exposed. Pujol had served both sides. That made him a target for all. So MI5 gave him a choice: witness protection or disappearance. He chose to disappear. And to do so, he would need to fake his own death. In the summer of 1949, a death certificate was quietly filed in Angola. Cause: malaria. Victim: Juan Pujol García. The details were sparse, the body never found, but the paperwork was official. To the world, Garbo was dead. To those who had known his legend, those few who knew the truth, it was a necessary fiction. The British buried his files. His MI5 handlers moved on to new Cold War fronts. In Germany, the remnants of the Abwehr marked his death with grim resignation. There were no memorials, no obituaries, no monuments to the man who had bent the will of an empire. But in truth, Juan Pujol García was alive. He resurfaced under a new identity in a small town near Lagunas, Venezuela. There, surrounded by jungle and distance, he became a clerk in a hardware store, living in obscurity and quiet exile. Even his children believed he was gone. He lived alone, haunted by memories and purpose. He never spoke of the war, never claimed credit. His letters, rare and encoded in vague metaphors, reached only one or two old contacts, who swore silence. The years passed. He read books on psychology and philosophy, trying to make sense of what he had done. He had deceived Nazis, yes. But he had also deceived the world, including the people who had trusted him most. His lies had saved thousands, but also cost him everything. By the 1960s, even the British forgot him. Only one man remembered. A Scottish historian named Nigel West, digging through declassified MI5 files, found fragments of the Garbo operation. Curious, he tracked connections, pieced timelines, and followed old whispers from Lisbon to Madrid, then to South America. In 1984, West arrived in Venezuela. He found an old man with weary eyes, slow speech, and scars no one could see. Pujol was reluctant, cautious. He had survived too much to trust a stranger. But West brought something no one else had: recognition. "You were the one who fooled Hitler," he said. Pujol lowered his gaze. He didn't speak of medals. He didn't speak of glory. What he finally said was this: "I only wanted to stop them." He returned to Europe once, briefly, under a veil of secrecy. He visited Normandy. He stood at the graves of men who had died under his deception, the soldiers who had stormed beaches while the Germans watched the wrong horizon. He wept. Later that year, he met Prince Philip. He met heads of MI5. He was offered honors, awards, even money. He declined them all. Recognition wasn't his goal. He had long ago decided his war had no victors, only survivors. He died in Caracas in 1988, quietly, with few knowing who he had once been. In the footnotes of history, his name is rarely mentioned. But in the shadows of World War II, where lies held more power than bombs, Juan Pujol García had been both phantom and force. And in the heart of Nazi command, the man they trusted most was never real. Autumn 1943 had settled over London like a damp curtain. The war raged across Europe, but in a modest townhouse in Bayswater, Juan Pujol García sat at a small desk under a flickering lamp, constructing entire worlds from ink and imagination. Each night, he wrote encrypted letters to Berlin, fabricated logistics reports, troop updates, sightings of non-existent military convoys. He labored for hours, inventing movements of ghost divisions, crafting messages with precise inconsistencies meant to mimic real-life confusion. It was an art form now, a deadly one. Garbo's strength lay in plausibility. He never overreached. Every message was calibrated to include minor, believable errors, misidentified regiments, wrong serial numbers, just enough to lend authenticity. British intelligence analysts marveled at his attention to psychological nuance. His fake agents bickered in their reports. Some missed deadlines. One agent, a Manchester widow turned informant, occasionally sent in drunken, incoherent reports. Garbo made them human. But behind the theatrical success was a personal cost. His family had been moved under MI5 protection, living under assumed names in a small village outside London. He saw them rarely, always under surveillance. His wife grew withdrawn. His son barely recognized him. Isolation became his companion. Even within MI5, few trusted him completely. He was valuable, yes, but expendable. There were debates in dark paneled rooms over whether to continue the Garbo operation. Some argued he was becoming too central, too visible. One senior official even recommended quietly retiring him before the war ended. But others knew better. By early 1944, Garbo had done what no Allied operative had ever accomplished. He had become the centerpiece of German intelligence in Britain. The Abwehr relied on his information more than any other source. They praised his reliability in coded communiques. Berlin even expanded his budget, increasing payments to support his fictitious sub-agents. Pujol used those funds to pay British operatives who posed as members of his network when verification was needed. It was a game of shadows, and every player had to remember their lines. Then came an unexpected twist. In March 1944, the Germans requested something dangerous: a live courier. They wanted one of Garbo's agents to meet an Abwehr officer in neutral Lisbon and deliver intelligence in person. It was a test, a chance for Berlin to verify that Garbo's network wasn't just paper and code. MI5 panicked. There were meetings late into the night. Several officials suggested abandoning the Garbo operation altogether. But the head of the XX committee, Sir John Masterman, proposed a bold alternative: send an MI5 officer in disguise. They chose an actor-turned-spy named Roger Haversham. He was trained for weeks, drilled on the fictional backstory of one of Garbo's invented agents, a retired Irish sailor named Seamus O'Neill. Every line of his character had been written by Pujol. The meeting in Lisbon was brief. The Abwehr officer arrived with suspicion. Haversham, playing O'Neill, was gruff, impatient, and half-drunk, exactly as Garbo had described him. They exchanged coded phrases. They shared pre-arranged gossip. The German left satisfied. Garbo's legend was now airtight. Berlin doubled his funding, and more importantly, they dismissed reports from other sources contradicting his intelligence. He had become a gatekeeper of truth, in a world built on lies. But victory brings new dangers. By May 1944, with Operation Overlord looming, the British pinned the success of the Normandy landings in large part on Pujol's continued deception. Any slip, any doubt, could undo years of planning. Garbo knew, and the pressure began to break him. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, Pujol barely slept. The smallest detail, a mistimed radio message, a misinterpreted phrase, could unravel the illusion and send Allied forces into a slaughter. He understood that more than any general, because he had built the scaffolding of lies that now supported the entire operation. His most dangerous moment came on the night of June 5, 1944. From a secure bunker in London, Garbo transmitted an urgent message to the Germans. British forces were preparing to move. Paratroopers were mobilizing. Something significant was underway, but he worded it carefully, enough to appear truthful without giving the precise landing location. MI5 debated the timing. If the message reached Berlin too early, they might scramble reinforcements to Normandy. Too late, and his credibility might collapse. The transmission was intentionally delayed by the British, delivered only after the landings had already begun. Pujol panicked. He feared the delay would destroy the trust he'd cultivated. But the Germans interpreted it differently. They believed his hands had been tied, that he had tried to warn them, and that British authorities had prevented his timely report. This reinforced their belief in his position inside the British war machine. It was a masterstroke. Even after Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Pujol continued to feed Berlin false updates. He claimed the main force was still waiting across the Channel. He described reserves stationed in Kent, supply ships gathering in Dover, and a second, larger assault force led by General Patton. Berlin listened. They ordered their divisions in Calais to stand firm. For weeks, Hitler refused to reassign them to Normandy. As the Allies broke out from the beachheads and began their drive toward Paris, critical German reinforcements sat idle, awaiting an attack that would never come. Garbo had bought the Allies time. Time to land, to regroup, to advance. The tide of war had turned. But even as Allied commanders praised the success of the deception, Garbo himself began to unravel. He confided in his MI5 handler, Thomas Harris, that he felt adrift. His lies had grown so vast, so intricate, that he no longer recognized the truth. He feared he might slip. He asked to see his family, but the war made that impossible. He requested a break, permission to step away, if only briefly. MI5 declined. There was still work to do. The Germans had not yet surrendered. His legend had to be maintained. So Garbo continued. He sent reports of Allied troops encircling Calais. He claimed his sub-agents were witnessing naval build-ups and training exercises. He even invented minor casualties among his fictional operatives to enhance the illusion of risk. His greatest achievement came after the liberation of Paris. In August 1944, he sent a detailed report explaining why the invasion force had never struck Calais. High winds, he claimed, and German vigilance. He assured his handlers that the second wave had been called off, but only temporarily. Berlin swallowed the story whole. Even as Allied tanks approached the German border, the Abwehr continued to await an assault on Calais. Pujol had not just manipulated tactics, he had rewritten strategy. But in his flat in London, alone and exhausted, Juan Pujol García began to dread the very thing he had once pursued. The end. A man without a country, a family, or a name. As the European war drew to a close in the spring of 1945, London's atmosphere shifted from tense anticipation to wary relief. The German war machine was collapsing. Cities were falling, generals surrendering, bunkers cracking under Allied bombardment. But for Juan Pujol García, the end of combat was not the end of danger. In an MI5 briefing room, he sat across from two senior officials who, for months, had monitored every word he transmitted. They now spoke of de-escalation. His radio would go silent. The fake agents he had created would be retired. But there was no clear plan for him. The irony stung. The man who had outwitted Hitler now posed an inconvenience. Pujol asked for a new assignment, but the response was clinical. There was no longer a role for him. His usefulness had expired. He was thanked in the cold language of bureaucracy: critical contribution, unique operational value, commendable service. But no one offered protection. MI5, obsessed with secrecy, feared that Pujol's existence might be leaked. If the Soviets discovered Garbo's identity, he could be abducted, or worse, recruited. Nazi sympathizers might seek vengeance. And anti-fascist purists might target him, believing him to have been a genuine collaborator. He was, in every sense, a ghost with enemies on all sides. So Pujol proposed his own solution. He would disappear. MI5 agreed, but not without conditions. His wife and children would remain in Britain under assumed identities. He would stage his own death far from Europe. All documents would be sealed. And Garbo, the codename, the legend, would vanish. In July 1945, Pujol boarded a freighter to Angola under the name José Luis García. 3 months later, a cable was sent from Luanda to London. Juan Pujol García had died of malaria. No funeral, no grave. Just a typewritten memo that closed the file. But his new life was no escape. Venezuela, where he eventually settled, offered anonymity, but not peace. He worked in low-wage jobs: translator, bookkeeper, later clerk. No one suspected the truth. But every morning, he awoke with the weight of his past pressing on his chest. He wrote letters he never sent. To his children, to his wife, to the men and women who had unknowingly been shaped by his fiction. In one letter, he wrote, "The cost of deceiving evil is the price of being believed by no one." Years passed. His hair turned silver. His hands, once steady enough to encode deception, now trembled. But he still remembered each of his sub-agents' names, their fake habits, their made-up birthdays. They were, in a strange way, his family. Then came the stranger. In 1984, a Scottish author named Nigel West, after years of combing British archives, arrived in Caracas with a question few had dared to ask. Is Garbo still alive? The meeting was brief. Pujol, now in his 70s, greeted him in a bare apartment filled with second-hand furniture. When West revealed who he was, Pujol was silent for a long time. Then, softly, he said, "You are the first to come looking." That year, he returned to Europe. Quietly, cautiously, he visited Normandy, stood on the beaches he had once shielded with fiction. He wept as he walked among the graves. Not for what he had done, but for the lives spared, and the lives lost because of what was necessary. He met former MI5 officers. He declined every medal offered. When pressed for interviews, he simply said, "I told stories." And people believed them. But there was one more twist. Before he left, he was invited to Berlin, to the archives of the former Abwehr. There, among yellowed files and broken photographs, he found his own name, Agent Arabelle, written in a Nazi officer's hand. Beside it, trustworthy, consistent, irreplaceable. Even in defeat, they had never discovered the truth. Pujol smiled once, then walked away. The final years of Juan Pujol Garcia's life unfolded in a quiet rhythm: morning walks, the rustle of newspapers, the echo of his own thoughts. Caracas had grown louder, busier, more chaotic. But within his modest flat, the world remained suspended in a long pause, as if the war had never ended. He never remarried. He rarely spoke of his past, even to the few friends he allowed close. What little he said often sounded like fiction, and he never corrected those who thought he was simply eccentric. But one part of his mind stayed sharp. The part that remembered the signals, the disguises, the tiny slips that could unmake a lie. He still had the mental reflexes of a man whose every word could trigger a war. In private, he studied. Not maps or troop movements, those were behind him, but human behavior. He read Jung, Freud, and Viktor Frankl. He pondered how fear shaped loyalty, how desperation gave birth to myth. He scribbled ideas into notebooks that no one would read, reflections on trust, betrayal, and the moral calculus of espionage. In one entry, he wrote, "The world values truth, but it follows conviction. A good lie told with conviction can move armies." In 1985, a small European documentary team tracked him down and asked to film a short interview. He declined the camera, but answered questions in audio. When asked how he had maintained such a complex illusion without faltering, he replied, "Because the enemy wanted to believe it. I only gave them what they needed." Even decades later, he remained cautious. He believed the Cold War had created a new generation of watchers, people who still remembered names like Garbo, even if the files were buried. He suspected that somewhere, his reports were being studied by students in intelligence academies, dissected like rare artifacts. He was not wrong. In the 1990s, when British intelligence finally declassified large parts of Operation Fortitude, historians realized the extent of Garbo's reach. Analysts confirmed that over 95% of Abwehr reports from Britain during the war had originated from his fabrications. He had not merely fooled Hitler, he had effectively blinded the entire Nazi command. One MI5 veteran, speaking off record, said, "There was no Allied double agent more complete, more convincing, more impactful than Garbo. He did not just change the war, he changed espionage." And yet, no statues were raised. No parades honored him. His greatest achievements remained buried in appendices and footnotes, overshadowed by generals, prime ministers, and victors. In 1988, at the age of 76, Juan Pujol García died quietly in Caracas. His passing made no headlines. His grave bore no codename, no mention of the empire he had deceived or the thousands he had saved. But history has a long memory. In 2000, a plaque was placed near the beaches of Normandy. It bore no photographs, only an inscription. "To the man who fought with shadows and saved with lies. Agent Garbo." It was placed by veterans who never knew his face, but owed their lives to his fiction. He remains, perhaps, the only man to receive medals from both the Nazis and the Allies, for the same war, the same lies, the same breathtaking deception. Juan Pujol García lived as a ghost. But history remembers him as the man who fooled Hitler, and never looked back.